The first time I saw the fence, I was still in my dress uniform, dust from the flight still on my boots. "This is HOA property now, Mr. Doss," she said, tapping her clipboard like it was a Bible. "The spring belongs to the community. We're building a wellness spa. You should be thanking us." That was Marlene Kessler, president of the Emberstone Village Homeowners Association, standing in front of my grandfather's steaming hot spring with a chain-link fence behind her and a smile that never once reached her eyes. 220 homes. That's how many houses sat down the hill from that spring, every single one of them warmed through the winter by pipes that ran straight back to water my family had owned since 1941. Marlene didn't know that, not yet. She'd already collected $3,800 from every homeowner in that valley. She called it an eco-heat assessment. Do the math, $836,000 just for green geothermal upgrades she never installed. And that was the small money. The real number, the one that would come out in a courtroom 11 months later, was $2.4 million, vanished into a shell construction company with her son-in-law's name on the paperwork. By the end, Marlene Kessler would pay back every stolen cent, and she'd do it from a jail visitation room, in a paper jumpsuit, in a house that had gone dark and cold 3 weeks after she fenced off my family's water. What she didn't understand, standing there in her $400 boots that had never touched a cow pie in their life, was that the spring behind that fence wasn't just pretty scenery for rich retirees. It was the furnace. It fed every radiant floor, every heated driveway, every hot tub in that whole overpriced village they called Emberstone. And the paper that proved it was mine, sitting in a fireproof box in my grandfather's roll-top desk, 40 minutes down the road, waiting. I didn't say a word to her that day. I just took a picture of the fence, checked my watch, 2:47 p.m., I remember exactly, and drove home. If you're watching this from Colorado or Montana or anywhere else winters bite hard enough to crack a pipe, ask yourself something before we go further. What would you do if somebody fenced off the one thing keeping 220 families warm and didn't know it belonged to you? Drop where you're watching from in the comments. I want to know how many of you have already smelled the sulfur on a cold morning and known exactly what I'm talking about. My name is Walt Doss. Everybody calls me Walt. I'm 62 years old, and until 4 years ago, I spent 31 years as a combat engineer in the United States Army. The last 11 of those specializing in water systems, wells, aquifers, pipelines, the invisible plumbing that keeps bases alive in places where nothing should be alive at all. I've drilled wells in deserts where the enemy was thirst before it was ever a person. I know water. I know it better than I know most people, if I'm honest. The ranch I came home to sits at the base of the Wasatch foothills. On 1,100 acres, my grandfather, Eli Doss, homesteaded in 1941. He wasn't a rich man. He was a sheep rancher who happened to notice steam rising out of a crack in the granite one January morning, and instead of ignoring it, he rode into town and filed a water right on it before anybody else thought to. Back then, nobody wanted hot mineral water. They wanted grazing land. Eli got both. He built a bathhouse over that spring with his own hands, cedar planks, a tin roof, a door that still sticks in July from the humidity. My father added onto it in the 60s. I used to sit in that water as a boy, watching steam curl up into cold mountain air, listening to my grandfather tell me the same thing every single time. "Walt, that water right there is worth more than every dollar this family will ever see above ground. Don't you ever let anybody tell you different." I didn't understand him then. I understood him completely the day I came home from my last deployment and found a chain-link fence standing where the bathhouse door used to be. The ranch house itself smells the way it's always smelled. Diesel from the tractor shed, cut hay drying in the loft, and under all of it, faint and mineral and a little bit like a struck match, the smell of sulfur drifting up from the spring even from 300 yards away. My grandfather's roll-top desk still sits in the front room, the wood dark and worn smooth where 3 generations of Doss hands have rested while doing the books. Inside the bottom drawer, behind a false panel my father showed me when I was 19 and he was dying of the same cancer that would eventually get him, sits a fireproof lockbox. Inside that box, a 1943 Utah Territorial Water Certificate, a 1961 conservation and well abandonment license, and every tax document proving the Doss family has held uninterrupted rights to that spring for 81 years. My grandfather never once let those rights lapse, not through droughts, not through the Depression's tail end, not through anything. He used to say, a water right you don't defend is a water right you don't have. 3 generations of my family are buried on a low hill behind the barn, under a stand of cottonwoods that turn gold every October. My grandfather, my father, my mother, who died the year before I shipped out the last time. I hadn't visited those graves in almost 2 years by the time I finally rolled my truck up the gravel drive that April, duffel bag still packed, and saw what Emberstone Village had done to the one thing my grandfather told me never to let go of. Emberstone Village wasn't there when I left. It was cattle pasture and BLM land mostly. Somewhere in the 18 months I was overseas, a developer had carved out 220 half-acre lots on the far side of the ridge, built identical stone and timber homes with radiant heated floors, and sold every single one of them on a single promise: geothermal living, 0 fossil fuels, warm feet in January, guaranteed. Marlene Kessler ran the whole operation. 54 years old, silver blonde hair cut into a bob that never moved, driving a white Range Rover with an Emberstone Village Wellness Collective sticker in the back window. She wore designer blazers to HOA meetings held in a clubhouse with a stone fireplace that never needed a match, because the floor beneath it was warm enough to bake bread on. She carried a clipboard everywhere, like it gave her authority, instead of just making her look like she was perpetually taking inventory of other people's lives. She'd been the community's president for 3 years by the time I got home, and in that time she had convinced 220 homeowners, retirees, veterans, young families who'd stretched every dollar to buy into sustainable mountain living that the wellness spa going up around my grandfather's spring was the crown jewel of their investment. What none of them knew, what Marlene herself may not have fully understood at first, was that the loop of pipe running under every one of their heated floors traced back through bedrock to a single source, the same crack in the granite my grandfather found in 1941, sitting on land that had never, not for one single day, belonged to the Emberstone Village Homeowners Association. She just fenced it off anyway, filed paperwork with the county calling it shared community infrastructure, put up a sign that said future site Emberstone Wellness Spa opening next spring. And when I stood at that fence and told her, calmly, that the spring was privately owned, she looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that wandered onto a golf course. "I'm sure your family's very proud of their little cabin history," she said, "but this is a $2.4 million development, Mr. Doss. We have investors, we have permits. I'd hate for this to get complicated for you." I just nodded, took another photograph, and drove home to that roll-top desk. She had no idea how complicated it was about to get. The letter came 4 days later, certified mail, return receipt requested, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. I signed for it at 9:12 a.m. on a Thursday, standing on my own porch in my own boots, and I remember thinking that was a strange time for the county to send anything, because the county never moved that fast for anybody. It wasn't from the county, it was from the Emberstone Village Homeowners Association, on letterhead with a little embossed pine tree logo, informing me that my unauthorized structure, the bathhouse my father built with his own hands in 1963, was in violation of Emberstone Village Covenant 14.3, governing aesthetic standards for structures adjacent to community wellness infrastructure. The fine was $1,100 a week, retroactive to the date the fence went up. Enclosed was a notice of lien intent against my property, filed with the county recorder's office. I read it twice, then I laughed, out loud, standing alone on my porch, because whoever drafted that letter didn't understand something very basic. My ranch had never joined the Emberstone Village Homeowners Association. I wasn't a member. You cannot fine a man for violating covenants he never signed. But I didn't call anybody. I didn't drive up to that clubhouse and start shouting. 31 years in the army teaches you that the man who reacts first usually loses, and the man who documents first usually wins. So I got a legal pad and I started a log. Every entry got a date, a time, and a fact. No opinions, just facts. Thursday, 9:12 a.m. Received certified letter, Emberstone Village, HOA, threatening lien against property not enrolled in association. Photographed letter, envelope, postmark. I drove to the fence that same afternoon and photographed it from 4 angles, making sure the timestamp was visible on my phone. 2:51 p.m. I photographed the new sign bolted to the chain link. Future site, Emberstone Wellness Spa. A rendering of infinity pools steaming under pine trees. My grandfather's bathhouse nowhere in the picture because they'd already torn it down. I stood there a long moment, looking at where the cedar planks used to be. Gone. Hauled off, probably to a dumpster somewhere. 80 years of my family's history reduced to scrap lumber because a woman with a clipboard decided it was in the way of her rendering. I didn't touch the fence. I didn't cut a single link. I just wrote it all down. And I mailed my own letter back, certified, return receipt requested, same as theirs, informing the Emberstone Village HOA in writing that Walt Doss and the Doss Family Trust held recorded water rights to the parcel in question dating to 1943, that the association held no easement, no deed, and no legal authority over the property, and that any further trespass would be documented for potential action under Utah Code 76-6-206, criminal trespass, and Utah Code 57-13-4, governing water right interference. I didn't hear back. What I got instead, 6 days later, was Marlene Kessler standing at my front gate at 4:30 in the afternoon, in a cream-colored blazer that had never seen a speck of ranch dust, flanked by a man in a golf polo I didn't recognize. "Mr. Doss," she said, "I think there's been some confusion. This is Grant Voss, our development consultant. We just want to clear the air." Grant Voss didn't offer his hand. He held a folder instead, and from it he produced a photocopy of a deed showing the spring parcel transferred from Doss Family Holdings to Emberstone Village Community Trust in 2019. "This was recorded 3 years ago," Grant said. "Your family sold this parcel as part of the original development agreement." I looked at that paper for a long moment. Then I looked up at him. "My father died in 2017, I said. "He never sold anything in his life he didn't tell me about first. And I hold power of attorney on this entire estate since 2015. Nobody sold this parcel. Nobody had the authority to." Marlene's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did, just for a second. "Well," she said, "I'm sure the county has the original on file. Perhaps there's been a clerical error." "Perhaps," I said, and I took a photograph of that deed, right there in her hand, before she could stop me. 4:37 p.m. Then I asked her to leave my property, politely, the way you'd ask a man to step back from a live wire he didn't know was hot. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my grandfather's roll-top desk with every document I owned spread out under the lamp, and I called the county recorder's office first thing the next morning. It took 3 days and a records request under Utah's Government Records Access and Management Act, GRAMA they call it, Section 63G-2-201, before a clerk named Denise finally emailed me the recorder's actual file on that parcel. There was no 2019 sale. There never had been. What there was instead was a forged signature, my father's name, dated 4 months after he'd already been buried, notarized by a notary public whose license, according to the Utah Division of Professional Licensing, had been revoked in 2018 for exactly this kind of fraud. That's when I stopped being angry and started being methodical, because a forged deed isn't a mistake, it's a felony. Utah Code 76-6-501, forgery, and 76-8-504, falsification of government records. Somebody had built an entire wellness spa on a lie, and I intended to find out exactly how deep that lie went. I started with public records, county planning applications, HOA financial disclosures filed with the state, anything with Marlene Kessler's name or Emberstone Village Community Trust attached to it. I spent 6 evenings at that desk, the lamp burning late, my dog Ranger asleep at my feet, the smell of the wood stove mixing with dust off 80-year-old ledgers I pulled down from the attic to cross-reference against my grandfather's original filings. That's where I met Eleanor Chase. She lived 2 lots down from the clubhouse, in one of the original Emberstone homes, a widow of 78 who'd buried her husband, a Vietnam veteran named Roy, 11 months earlier. I found her by accident. She was standing at her own mailbox in a housecoat and an oxygen cannula, staring at a notice of lien intent that looked exactly like mine, except hers wasn't a bluff. Hers was real. The HOA was foreclosing on her because she'd fallen 4 months behind on the $3,800 eco-heat assessment every homeowner had been charged the year before. Roy's pension covers the mortgage, she told me, her voice thin, the oxygen tank hissing softly beside her wheelchair ramp. It doesn't cover $3,800 I never agreed to pay for heating we already had. My floors have been warm since the day we moved in, young man. Warm the whole time. I don't understand what I'm supposedly paying for now. I stood there in her driveway, looking at her lien notice, and something clicked into place that I hadn't let myself see yet. If the spring had been heating those floors for free, through a natural loop nobody at Emberstone Village had built or paid for, then what exactly was Marlene Kessler charging $3,800 a house for? I went home that night and pulled every HOA financial disclosure filed with the Utah Department of Commerce for the past 3 years. It took me until nearly 2 in the morning, cross-referencing line items against contractor invoices before I found it. A construction company called Highline Geothermal Solutions LLC paid $2.4 million over 18 months for wellness spa infrastructure development, permits, drilling, piping, none of which had actually been done, because the only drilling on that mountain had been done in 1941 by my grandfather with a spring that already worked. Highline Geothermal Solutions LLC had been registered 11 months earlier. Its listed manager was a man named Derek Voss, same last name as the development consultant, standing at my gate with a forged deed in his hand. I sat back in my grandfather's chair, the lamp burning low, and for the first time since I'd come home, I understood exactly what I was looking at. This wasn't a fence dispute. This was a woman who had taken $836,000 in fake eco-assessments from 220 homeowners, funneled $2.4 million more from the spa development budget into her own son-in-law's shell company, and forged a dead man's signature to make it all look legal on paper. And she had done every bit of it standing on top of the one thing she never bothered to actually understand. A spring that didn't belong to her, feeding warmth into houses that didn't belong to her either, 2 pipes that ran back, every single one of them, to a certificate sitting in a fireproof box, 40 feet from where I was sitting right now. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat with Ranger's head on my boot and read the Highline invoices 3 more times, looking for a mistake I might have made, some innocent explanation for why a company with no drilling permits, no equipment registered with the state, and no employees I could find anywhere had been paid $2.4 million for work that had never happened. There wasn't one. The numbers just sat there on the page, cold and plain, the way numbers do when they're guilty. The next morning I drove back to Eleanor Chase's place, this time with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad, because I figured a woman who'd been married to an infantry sergeant for 50 years wouldn't want to be talked down to. And she wasn't. She met me on the porch in the same housecoat, oxygen line trailing behind her like a leash on something invisible, and she waved me up before I'd even gotten the truck door shut. "You found something," she said, not a question. I did. "Well, sit down then. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I'm not craning my neck about you." I told her most of it, the shell company, the forged deed, the assessment money that didn't match any actual construction. She listened with her hands folded in her lap, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ridge where the spa fence caught the morning light. "Roy used to say the ones who talk the most about community are the ones stealing the most from it," she said finally. "He'd have liked you, young man. He didn't trust anybody who wore a blazer to a homeowners meeting." I asked her if she'd be willing to keep her lien paperwork, her assessment invoices, anything with Marlene's signature on it somewhere safe. She told me she'd kept every piece of paper Roy ever brought home from 30 years in the army, and she wasn't about to stop being careful now. "Bottom drawer, dining room hut," she said. "Nothing gets thrown out in this house."
Never has.
Walking back to my truck, I passed two more neighbors, a young couple, Danny and Priya Osei, out front hosing salt off their driveway before the next cold front. Danny flagged me down. "You're the rancher, right? Up past the fence." "That's right." "Everybody's talking about that lien notice on Mrs. Chase's mailbox. Kessler's been telling people it's routine collections. Doesn't feel routine to me." He glanced toward the clubhouse, voice dropping. "We paid that eco-assessment too. $3,800, same as everybody. Figured it was for real upgrades. You're saying it wasn't." I chose my words the way you choose your footing on ice. "I'm saying I have questions nobody at that HOA has answered yet. I'd hang on to every receipt you've got." Priya nodded slowly, arms crossed against the colt. "We noticed the floors have been warm since before any of this wellness spa business started. Never thought twice about it." Neither had 218 other households, I imagined. All of them warm all winter long, never once wondering where that heat actually came from or who'd been quietly billing them for something nature had been giving away for free since 1941. The cold front came in on a Tuesday, the kind of front you can smell 2 days before it arrives, a metal taste in the air, the cottonwoods going still like they knew something was coming. I remember checking the weather report at 6 a.m. and seeing the number. 11 degrees by Friday night, first hard freeze of the season. In my grandfather's day, that kind of cold meant checking on the sheep, breaking ice on the stock tanks, making sure nothing died overnight. Now it meant something else entirely. I'd already started building my case by then, not with anger, with paper. That's the thing about 31 years in the army that nobody tells you. It doesn't teach you to fight faster, it teaches you to fight slower and later and with better documentation than the other guy. I'd hired an attorney out of Provo named Sandra Kimball, a water rights specialist who'd spent 15 years litigating exactly this kind of dispute for ranch families getting squeezed by developers. Her office smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and she had a way of looking at documents like they'd personally wronged her. "Here's what most homeowners never understand," she told me, the first time I sat across from her desk with my grandfather's certificate laid flat between us. "A water right in this state isn't a suggestion. It's real property, same as land, same as a house. It can be sold, inherited, or seized, but it cannot simply be used by someone else because they built next to it. Emberstone Village doesn't own a single drop of that spring. They've just been drinking it for free." She filed a petition for declaratory judgment in the 4th District Court that same week, asking a judge to formally confirm what the county recorder's forged file was trying to hide, that the Doss family held sole, uninterrupted rights to the spring parcel since 1943, and that the 2019 deed transfer was void as a matter of law, executed on a forged signature 4 months after my father's death. Sandra also sent formal notice, certified mail, to Emberstone Village Homeowners Association, to Marlene Kessler personally, and to the Utah Division of Water Rights, informing all three that any continued diversion of water through the spring parcel was occurring without consent and without legal right. That notice mattered more than anything else I did that whole autumn, because under Utah Code 73-3-1, before you can lawfully curtail or shut off a water diversion that other parties are relying on, you have to give formal notice to every affected party and to the state engineer's office. I wasn't planning to just walk up one morning and turn a valve. I was building a case so airtight that when I finally did turn that valve, nobody, not a judge, not a sheriff, not 220 angry homeowners, could call it anything but a man exercising rights he'd held, on paper, since before most of them were born. I also installed 4 trail cameras along my fence line that week. My fence line, my property, perfectly legal, pointed at the spring headworks and the gate my grandfather had welded shut in 1978. I didn't tell anybody but Sandra and the county sheriff's substation, a deputy named Ruiz, who I'd gotten to know over coffee twice by then, both times bringing him copies of everything I had. "You're building a wall of paper," Ruiz said, flipping through the folder I'd brought him. "Most folks just get mad and do something stupid. You're doing the opposite." "Getting mad doesn't hold up in court," I told him. "Paper does." Thursday night, the cameras caught something I hadn't planned for. It was 11:40 p.m. I know because the timestamp burned into the corner of the footage, same as it burned into me later, watching it back at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold. 3 men in Emberstone Village work vests, headlamps cutting through the dark, walked up to my grandfather's welded gate, carrying a battery-powered angle grinder and a set of bolt cutters. One of them I recognized immediately from his walk, before I even saw his face clearly. Grant Voss, the development consultant who'd shown me the forged deed at my own front gate. They cut through my padlock in under 4 minutes. Grant directed 2 other men toward the spring housing itself, where my grandfather's original iron valve sat under a concrete cap, and I watched, my stomach going tight, as they pried the cap loose and shone a light down into the wellhead, measuring something, photographing something, though they never touched the valve itself. Trespassing on private, posted property, cutting a lock that wasn't theirs to cut, all of it time-stamped, all of it clear as day on 4 separate angles. I didn't call the sheriff that night. I wanted to see what else they'd do. Sandra had told me the same thing 3 separate times. A single trespass is a misdemeanor. A pattern of trespass, tied to a fraud scheme already under investigation, is a felony conspiracy. I needed the pattern. I got it 2 nights later, and it turned my stomach in a different way entirely. Danny Osei called me at 9:15 p.m. on Saturday, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. "Walt, you need to see this. I'm streaming it right now. Come over to Mrs. Chase's. Hurry." I drove the 4 minutes to Eleanor's house faster than I probably should have on ice, and when I pulled up, there were 2 Emberstone Village maintenance trucks in her driveway, hazard lights flashing red against the snow, and Grant Voss standing on her porch with a clipboard of his own, flanked by a man in a work vest holding a wrench. Eleanor stood in her doorway in her housecoat, oxygen cannula fogging slightly in the cold, one hand gripping the frame. "That backup propane unit is HOA community infrastructure," Grant was saying, loud enough that I heard it from the driveway. "Per Section 9.2 of the Covenants, it's being reallocated to the Spa construction site effective tonight. You'll be reconnected once the geothermal loop is fully operational." "That unit has kept me alive every winter since Roy installed it in 1994, Eleanor said, her voice thin but steady. "It's not community property, it's mine." "I'm just following orders, ma'am," Grant said, and the man beside him crouched down and started disconnecting the line right there, in front of her, in 11-degree cold, with an elderly widow on supplemental oxygen standing in the doorway watching her only backup heat source get hauled away on a hand truck. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Danny's phone was already recording, live, streaming to a Facebook group with 300 Emberstone Village residents in it, and I stood on that lawn with my own phone out too, capturing every second, Grant's face, the truck's license plate, the timestamp, 9:31 p.m. The propane unit being lifted into the truck bed while Eleanor Chase stood in her doorway with tears freezing on her cheeks. That was the moment something in me went quiet and cold in a different way than the weather. Because up to that point, this had been about a fence, a forged deed, stolen money. Now it was about a 78-year-old widow of a combat veteran, standing in her own doorway, watching strangers take away the thing keeping her breathing warm air. Because a woman in a cream blazer had decided her comfort was less important than a spa's construction schedule. Utah Code 62A-3-301 makes it a crime to knowingly deprive a vulnerable adult of necessary care or resources they depend on for health and safety. I knew that statute cold before I even got home that night, because Sandra had mentioned it to me weeks earlier, almost in passing, telling me it might become relevant. She'd been right. I sat at my grandfather's roll-top desk past midnight that night, and for the first time since I'd come home, I let myself feel something close to doubt. Not about whether Marlene Kessler deserved what was coming to her. I had no doubt about that anymore. My doubt was about the plan itself. Sandra and I had been building towards something bigger than lawsuits, bigger than fraud complaints. We'd been building toward the day I would exercise my actual right, my grandfather's certificate, the conservation license, the valve itself, and shut off the flow that fed 220 homes. 220 homes, not 220 Marlene Kesslers. 220 families, most of whom had no idea their eco-assessments were fraud, most of whom just wanted warm floors in winter, same as anybody. Eleanor Chase lived in one of those homes. The Osays lived in one of those homes. If I turned that valve, I'd be turning off heat to every one of them, innocent and guilty alike, in the dead of a mountain winter. I sat with that a long time, Ranger's head heavy and warm against my boot, the wood stove ticking as it cooled. And then I thought about what my grandfather used to say, sitting in that same bathhouse steam decades ago. A water right you don't defend is a water right you don't have. And I thought about what Sandra had told me just that week, sitting in her cluttered office. The law gives you the right to protect what's yours, but it also gives you the tools to do it without becoming the very thing you're fighting. That was the answer, sitting right there in front of me the whole time. I didn't have to punish 220 families to expose one woman's fraud. I just had to make sure that when the valve turned, and it would turn, every single person watching understood exactly why, exactly who was responsible, and exactly how they could get their heat, their money, and their dignity back the moment the fraud came down with it. I picked up the phone the next morning and called Sandra before 8. I want a hearing, I told her, a public one. HOA board, county officials, press if we can get them. I want Marlene Kessler standing in a room full of the people she stole from when I lay that certificate on the table. That, Sandra said, I can arrange. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of December, 2 p.m. in the Emberstone Village clubhouse, the same room with the fireplace that never needed a match, the floor beneath it warm enough that half the residents walked in without their coats on, never once wondering why. Sandra had gotten the county to send an observer from the Division of Water Rights, a soft-spoken engineer named Phil Aoki. Deputy Ruiz came in his own truck, off-duty but present because I'd asked him to be. A reporter from the Summit County Chronicle showed up too, a young woman named Kayla Brandt, who'd been quietly digging into Emberstone's finances for weeks after Danny Osei's livestream made its way around town. 220 homes meant a packed room. Folding chairs lined up 8 rows deep, homeowners in parkas and slippers, Eleanor Chase near the front in her wheelchair, oxygen tanks strapped to the side, Danny and Priya Osei beside her. Marlene Kessler sat at the board table up front in a charcoal blazer, clipboard resting in front of her like a shield. Grant Voss 2 seats down, looking considerably less confident than he had cutting my padlock at midnight. This meeting is called to discuss recent allegations regarding association finances, Marlene said, opening with the same flat, practiced tone she'd used on me at the fence 8 months earlier. I want to assure everyone that the board takes these concerns seriously and that any confusion about assessments will be. Mrs. Kessler, Sandra said, standing, before you continue, I'd like to enter something into the record. I walked to the front of that room carrying a single leather folder and I set it on the table in front of Marlene Kessler, close enough that she had to look at it. Inside was the 1943 Utah Territorial Water Certificate, my grandfather's original conservation and well abandonment license from 1961, and a certified copy of Sandra's 4th District Court petition, now bearing a judge's signature confirming what the county's forged file had tried to erase. The Doss family held sole, uninterrupted, superior right to the spring parcel, effective retroactively to 1943. The 2019 deed was void. It had always been void. The room went quiet in a way that a room full of 200 people rarely does. You could hear the fireplace crackling, gas-fed, floor beneath it warm as a held breath. "This is a family heirloom," Marlene said, barely glancing at it, that same condescension trying to hold its shape even as her voice thinned. "I'm sure it's meaningful to you, Mr. Doss, but it has no bearing on—" "It has every bearing," Phil Aoki said, standing now, reading glasses catching the firelight. "I've reviewed this certificate and the corresponding state engineer's filings this morning. Mr. Doss's water right predates any development agreement in this valley by 76 years. Every home in Emberstone Village currently draws geothermal loop water from a source this association has never legally owned and never had authorization to divert." I let that sit a moment. Then I did the thing I'd come to do. I'd brought Ruiz and Aoki out to the wellhead an hour before the meeting started, both of them watching, both of them signing off as official witnesses. And together we'd inspected my grandfather's original iron valve, still intact, still functional after 81 years, the one Grant Voss's crew had pried the concrete cap off of but never dared touch. With Ruiz's flashlight on my hands and Aoki's clipboard recording the exact time, 1:12 p.m., I had turned that valve 3/4 closed, cutting the diversion feeding Emberstone Village's loop down to a trickle, fully within my documented rights, fully witnessed, fully legal. Now, standing in that clubhouse, I told the room what I'd done. "As of 1:12 this afternoon," I said, "I have restricted flow from my family's spring, as is my legal right as sole owner of record. I did not do this to hurt any of you. I did this because Marlene Kessler and Grant Voss have been stealing from this community for 3 years, and I intend for every one of you to understand exactly how before this room adjourns." Kayla Brandt's camera was already rolling. I laid out the numbers the way Sandra and I had rehearsed. The $836,000 in eco-heat assessments, collected from 220 households, for upgrades that were never installed because the heat had always come free, from a spring the association never owned. The $2.4 million paid to Highline Geothermal Solutions LLC, a company with no drilling permits, no employees, and a sole manager named Derek Voss, Grant Voss's own son. The forged 2019 deed, my father's signature applied 4 months after his death, notarized by a man whose license had been revoked the year before for the exact same offense. Marlene's composure finally cracked somewhere around the word forged. She stood up fast enough to knock her clipboard to the floor. "This is absurd," she said, voice rising for the first time I'd ever heard it rise. "You have no right to shut off water to 200 homes over a family grudge." "It's not a grudge, Mrs. Kessler," Eleanor Chase said from her wheelchair, her voice carrying clean across the whole silent room. "It's the money you stole from Roy's pension. It's the propane tank your men took off my porch in 11-degree weather while I stood there in my housecoat. I'm 78 years old. I don't have grudges anymore. I have receipts." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in the low, furious murmur of 200 people realizing, all at once, exactly what had been done to them. Danny Osei stood up. Priya stood up. Someone near the back said, loud enough to carry, "I want my $3,800 back." Deputy Ruiz stepped forward then, and it was the quietest, most procedural thing I'd ever seen turn into the most satisfying moment of my life. "Marlene Kessler," he said, "I need you to step outside with me. We've got some questions from the county attorney's office regarding financial disclosures filed under your signature." He nodded once toward Grant Voss. "You too, sir." Marlene didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, not with 200 witnesses and a reporter's camera and a sheriff's deputy standing between her and the door. She just stood there for a second, in that warm, firelit room, clipboard on the floor at her feet, before she picked up her purse with hands that weren't quite steady anymore and walked out into the cold beside Ruiz, Grant Voss trailing behind her, neither one of them saying a word. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that. 200 people sitting in folding chairs, watching a woman who'd taken their money walk out through a door into a night that, for the first time in 3 years, was actually as cold outside her house as it would soon be inside every home in that valley. Until I turned that valve back open. Which I did the next morning, fully, once Sandra confirmed the court had entered a consent order recognizing my rights and establishing a formal paid easement. $3,000 a month split fairly among all 220 homes. a fraction of what they'd been defrauded for, going forward to me and my family in perpetuity, for water that had always been ours to give. The trial took 8 months. Marlene Kessler pled no contest to felony theft by deception under Utah Code 76-6-405, forgery and conspiracy to commit financial fraud against the Homeowners Association, facing a total exposure north of 15 years. She was sentenced to 7 years in the Utah State Prison and ordered to pay restitution of $2,400,000 to the Emberstone Village Community Trust, plus a separate $836,000 back to the 220 individual homeowners who'd paid the fraudulent eco-assessment. Grant Voss took a plea deal, testified against Marlene in exchange for 18 months and 5 years probation. His son Derek, the manager of Highline Geothermal Solutions LLC, was ordered to personally forfeit $400,000 in assets and barred from holding any construction license in the state of Utah for the rest of his life. The notary who'd forged my father's signature lost her freedom along with her license. 2 years, same courthouse, same judge. Eleanor Chase got her propane tank back within a week, delivered personally by the same county office that had let it slip through the cracks. 6 weeks after the trial concluded, the reorganized Emberstone Village Homeowners Association held new board elections, and the residents, the real residents, the ones who'd stood in that clubhouse and watched their president walk out in front of a sheriff, elected Eleanor Chase as their new president, unanimously on the first ballot. She told me later, sitting on her porch with a fresh oxygen tank and a cup of coffee, that Roy would have laughed himself sick at the idea of his widow running a homeowners association. But somebody's got to make sure nobody with a clipboard ever gets away with this again, she said. Might as well be me. I still live on the ranch. The bathhouse is being rebuilt. Same cedar plank design, same tin roof, using a photograph my father took in 1978 that I found tucked in the back of that roll-top desk. The spring still steams every morning into cold mountain air, same as it did when I was a boy, same as it did for my grandfather standing over that crack in the granite back in 1941. 3 generations rest on that hill behind the barn, and some mornings I walk up there with my coffee and just sit, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods, smelling sulfur and cut hay and diesel, feeling like I finally understood what my grandfather meant all those years ago when he told me that water right was worth more than every dollar this family would ever see above ground. Here's what I learned watching all of this unfold. A right you don't defend on paper isn't a right at all. It's just a hope, and hope doesn't hold up in court. Document everything, even when it feels paranoid, because the quiet man with the folder always outlasts the loud one with the clipboard. Vulnerable people, the widows, the veterans, the ones on oxygen tanks in 11-degree cold, are never collateral damage in these stories. They're the reason the fight matters in the first place. And greed always leaves a paper trail, if you're patient enough and angry enough in exactly the right, quiet way to go looking for it. Sandra called me last week, said the state auditor flagged something interesting going through Emberstone's old books during restitution proceedings. A second shell company, tied to a water district 2 counties over, with Marlene Kessler's name nowhere on it, but her handwriting all over the ledgers. Looks like Emberstone Village wasn't the only mountain community somebody's been quietly stealing warmth from. I think I'll be making a few phone calls of my own.